Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Process Podcast.
Mr. Carmichael,
Mr. Hain.
how are we doing, buddy?
Oh, we are doing fantastic.
Oh, great to hear.
Yes.
It's 5:11. It's getting late today.
5:11 it is, yeah.
You are normally out of here prepping dinner.
Prepping dinner. Yeah, I'd say I normally leave around like 5ish. Yeah, I should be on my way home, really.
Yeah.
But I just love spending time in the podcast, you know?
Oh, you and
Just
I
love
both.
it.
Liam, today we are talking about considerations when it comes to writing a group class program. So these are things, I do a lot of this, and I think I've been doing a lot of this for a really long time. So it's something I feel very comfortable with. But whenever I get to a point where I'm sharing the way that I write a group program with someone else, I realize just how much goes into it.
Yeah.
So much, which has kind of become, I guess, kind of automated
second
for
nature,
me.
yeah.
Second nature to me. I don't really think about. And these are things that, I sit and watch every single day when I'm watching our group classes go and picking out bits and bobs and how they can be improved. And the thing that brought this to light was, we have an amazing new program called TFL, Train for Life. And Lottie is running that program herself, and she's taken over full programming and does a really great job of it.
Yeah.
But I now sit down with her quite frequently to talk about the programming of it, and not so much of just what goes into the program, but just then writing the program is one thing, but then seeing the program executed on the training
And
floor
delivered.
in the group class
Yeah.
is a very different thing. And there's so many little things you got to consider. And so this conversation is about what do we think about when we actually write a group program that is being run in a class. So this is not, for example, the elite program. This is for people who follow the program by themselves. They don't really have a time limit, and they can just follow along at their own speed. So with that, it's a lot more open in terms of the template. But in a class, there's lots of things you have to consider.
Yes.
Any final thoughts before we dig into it?
No, let's go.
Okay. So I think the first thing that's super important is having clear intentions
Yeah.
or having goals behind the program. I think that goes without
For
saying.
any program.
Right. You can't to sit down and start writing a training program if there isn't a clear goal. Then it's going to be very, very hard, very, very challenging to write that program. Also, from a customer standpoint, what you say you're providing has to match with what you're actually delivering.
Yeah.
And that disconnect is often where people leave training programs because the program or the gym is saying that they're going to get one thing and they come and they're getting something else. So just to stop that, make sure you have clarity on that. Any thoughts on that? Anything to add?
I mean, just going off you having clarity, but then I think it's very important that you then communicate that those priorities or those intentions or the why behind the program to your people. I think we talk a lot about the importance of like planning, periodizing, and the third words were right.
Prioritizing, periodizing, planning.
And planning. Thank you, Ed. So those three, we talk about them.
Panicked a bit there.
Yeah, me too. We talk about them all the time. But I think that fourth step is the communication. So it's super important that you communicate to your people.
Yeah, and I think that communication piece is not just writing on the website what the intentions of it. It's something that needs to be rinsed and repeated every single day. And even we've had members here who've been here for a really long time, and even those people need reminding sometimes. So it's the messaging that goes on to things like collateral online, but it's also in your actual classes, just reminding people all the time.
Brief.
Exactly, the brief every day. What is the goal of the program? What are we trying to achieve here? I think the next thing to move into is intentions.
Yeah.
And intentions isn't just the intention of the program, which is a more macro thing that we just talked about, but intentions behind every single session as well. And again, this goes back to like when we sit down and do the 3 Ps.
Yep.
Planning, periodizing, and prioritizing.
Yeah. So I was giving you a wee time there to panic.
We basically create a focus for a training cycle. Maybe that's a 4 to 8 to 12 week training cycle. And then within that, every single day has a focus.
Yep.
And if you don't go through that phase, that whole process of laying that all out and you just sit down and start writing in exercises, reps and sets, it gets super confusing. So, and even if you're doing it, you're writing a training program that is really varied in nature. Maybe you're writing something like our TFL program, which is a lot less structured. It still has clear intention, but it's maybe not as linearly progressed as our other programs. Even with that, you've still got to have some intention.
Yes.
Maybe those intentions can be like, okay, on this day, we're going to do some form of squatting pattern and a pulling pattern. This can be like a push-pull lunge. Even that is giving you some structure to know what to start to write. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like, okay, yeah, you've got the macro view, but it's okay, what's actually happening on that day within this class? If this is a 60-minute class, what is I know we're going to talk about dose responses and stuff, but what is it actually want to get out of this single session?
Yes, and I think that thing has to be clear and has to be obvious to anyone who's taking part in it.
Correct.
So if you're a coach and you're saying that this is the intention of the day, and if we're clients doing it,
something
and they're like,
different, yeah,
I can't see that intention in anything we're doing
yeah.
right now, then that's obviously, again, another disconnect. So it's super important that you're communicating that to your people. So I think this next one is super important, which is, who is your audience? And so something I have to think about a lot, which is, I write training programs for 4, I guess, like mixed modal, or let's just call them like CrossFit programs. We've got Live program, Perform, Compete, and Elite. And it's not necessarily a beginner to advanced, but when you look at the people who follow those programs, because the prerequisites that we have, we really do have the Live program is people with a younger training age or a bit newer to the sport, or people who don't really have athletic endeavors or goals. The Perform program is for people kind of being in probably the CrossFit space anywhere between 2 to maybe even 10 years, but probably aren't taking it as seriously, or not. It's probably not one of their biggest priorities in their life. And then you get into the Compete and Elite programs. These are people who've been doing it for much longer.
Yeah, they want to prioritize that.
They're talented individuals, And so that has a massive bearing on the way that I write those programs. And when I say that, there's lots of things you got to consider there. It's like the complexity of your movements. Like, you've got to be smart in terms of if a general avatar for a training group is more beginner or younger in training age, you got to think about the complexity of movements you're picking. If you're picking like you're using complexes, or something I think about all the time is like the repetitiveness of movements. When you're dealing with people with younger training ages, you can't just be putting brand new movements every single week, because what starts to happen is that you end up spending the whole class trying to teach people new skills when the intention of the exercise is actually to get someone strong, or to build muscle, or to build strength endurance, and you lose out on that dose response. Whereas when you work with more advanced people, you can afford to have a bit more variety in the program, because you know that these people are going to pick it up and execute it pretty much straight away.
Well, I think just going off that is the importance of respecting the strength continuum and understanding where people lie. Like, we know within the Live program, our general avatar of the Live program have got a younger training age, so their priority day is a Thursday. And when we look at their type of priority day, it's a lot of motor control, strength endurance work, a lot of hypertrophy work, because we know that essentially our Live guys, what's stopping them from progressing to the things that maybe they want to do is literally because they're just not strong enough. Right, so a lot of their priorities and a lot of stuff that we focus on is just getting these people strong, and that comes from a lot of motor control. So they're doing like split squats, variations of pull-ups, etc. We flip that to the other side and we look at like Elite or Compete people, because we're talking about class programming. Well, we can kind of a bit more fun there with priorities. It's like their priority may be looking at some rope climbs, maybe looking at some more complex skills in comparative to their Live program.
Yeah. What was I thinking about that? Something you said there just sparked an idea in me.
Priorities? No. Different days of priorities. Motor control, strength continuum.
Yes, thank you. That was exactly it. So when I think about the TFL program, Training for Life, where there are no prerequisites for this program, anyone can essentially come in and do it. We essentially have said the training adaptations from a strength training perspective are only ever going to be muscle endurance, hypertrophy, and maybe we'll dip into some strength endurance, but probably not. And that's easy, because that immediately defines your rep ranges.
Well, you've now got these parameters to work with, right?
You don't need to be doing strength training sets anything really under 30 seconds, because we know that the people doing that program are not going to be able to elicit a strength response because their training age isn't high enough. Whereas you go to the Compete program, or ignore Elite because it's not a group it's not a class program. But when you look at something like the Compete program, like these guys are training for the sport of CrossFit. We need to be exposing them to 1 rep maxes, 20 rep maxes, and everything in between. And then, when we look at our Perform program, the heaviest we're probably going to go for those guys is just, sometimes we'll test some 1 RMs, but generally we're hovering around the kind of 2, 3, 4, 5 RMs for those guys, because we know that that's their training age, and we've got to think about that. So, those are things that the rep schemes and taking into account someone's training age is super important.
But that all came, I remember the conversation with TFL, because it didn't happen that long ago, when we sat here and we sat with the whiteboard, and it's like, who is it that we're trying to serve? What's their avatar? And what's the parameters that we want to work with? And once we got that up on the board, it just became so much easier for Coach Lottie to then take that information and go and write a great program.
Yes.
Moving
on to the next thing, duration of the session. This is obvious. right, but do you have 30 minutes for a class? Do you have 45 minutes for a class? Do you have 60 minutes?
90 minutes.
You have 90-minute classes. You know, we actually do have a
barbell
class,
club, right?
a barbell club, which is a 90-minute class every Saturday.
That's a great class.
Yeah. And you know what that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, it's 90 minutes, so I've got to
Just
put more
do
volume in.
yeah.
That means as a coach, it gives you way more opportunities to actually break
Skill
movements down,
breakdown,
do skill
yeah.
breakdowns, do specific warm-ups to set people up for success for the main work that you
Nice.
programmed. But that's something you always got to consider.
Mm.
And I think something that piggybacks this nicely is, does your gym or do you as a coach have a consistent way that you deliver your group classes?
Yes.
So when we look at process programming, any process programming affiliate, or this all started at Coastal, we have a way that we run every single group class, which is, it always starts with a brief. And that brief is going to be a maximum really of like 3 minutes.
Yep.
Once that brief is done, that's basically when you're introducing someone to the workout. That then gives you about 12 minutes to get through a pretty comprehensive warm-up.
Yep.
So by the 15-minute mark, you need to be starting your A work.
work.
And like starting means like ready to load that A work.
Yeah, 3, 2, 1. we're
Exactly.
going, yeah.
We're starting the clock now. And then essentially, you got to finish that class on the 60 minutes. So that's something I'm always thinking about. Every time I write a group program for the Live, Perform or Compete programs, I'm always thinking about time.
Yep.
Like, is this going to be manageable? And it's not just, again, about squeezing in volume. It's always like this fine interplay between giving enough volume, but also being able to actually coach the class. We've all done it, and I sometimes still mess it up. Even after all these years of doing it, I still don't quite get it right, where I'll probably program too much volume in a session that as a coach, you're just scrambling, and you're not actually ever getting to coach people because you're just trying to get people through the workout, and that's not really the intention. Now, sometimes you can do that. If a workout was, for example, just like functional, so full body resistance training, nothing complex. It was just like it's pushing, pulling, lunging, hinging, some core work and some biceps and triceps. Well, then you can probably jack in a lot of volume in a session because there's super simple movements to coach. There's very little warming up that needs to be done, and you can just get straight into it. Now, the moment you start to play with snatches, muscle ups,
handstand walking,
handstand walking, double unders,
Yeah.
well, now you've got to respect that the time taken to warm up those movements is much longer. So you've got to factor that into your group class. And also, like, the complexity of the movements, there's a lot to warm up. Like, for a squat snatch, you're going to have to warm up the overhead position. You've got to warm up the spine. You've got to warm up the knees in a squat. And then you've got to warm up the technique of actually getting the movement dialed in. It takes a lot longer versus a dumbbell bench press.
Yeah. I mean, I think where my head's at that as well is what we do really well here at the Process Program is that we do structured training, right? So we notice on week one of a new cycle when you're coaching, sometimes it can be a bit crazy because there's a lot to cover, for example, coaching wise. But because it's structured and we generally linearly progress movements, once we're into like week 2, 3 and 4, well, we've kind of got a bit more space to then really dig into the coaching, because that first week can be sometimes a wee bit hectic just in terms of, because there's a lot going on, right?
Well, it's hectic for us because we're often teaching new movements
We're
that we
teaching
maybe
new
haven't
movements,
taught.
correct.
But it's also hectic for the people in the class because they're doing new movements. And so, especially
There's
with
a lot
resistance
going on.
training, like you're not really sure how to load. Let's say you haven't done a front squat in 12 weeks and then suddenly you got front squatting with a pause at the bottom. I have no idea how I'm supposed to load that. So that first week is kind of always just like dipping your toes in the water, both as a coach and a client. And then week 2, you're kind of like, all right, everyone was here last week. You know what we're doing. Everyone's like, yep, remember it. Okay, let's get into it.
And that's really good as a coach, because then you can, what you taught on week 1 can be completely different. You've got a bit more time to dive into the minute details of, for example, a barbell RDL. We could talk months on end about a barbell RDL, but you've now got that time to actually dig in and offer something more, different cues, etc.
And you get that chance to just look, know that, okay, I remember what I saw with Liam last week in class. I got a chance to coach that movement again with him to improve in the following week. Okay, equipment available. This is another really simple one, but equipment available isn't just, I've got dumbbells, I've got kettlebells, I've got barbells, I've got a rack, but it's also how many people I've got in a class. How many piece of each equipment do I actually have? And I think this is something that people so often overlook. This is something with our affiliate program, because when people join our affiliate program, they're essentially running our Live, Perform, Compete TFL classes in their gym. We have minimum equipment requirements that a gym must meet because our program is based upon these minimum equipment requirements. And that means like has to be X number of rowers relative to your class cap. There has to be X number of dumbbells relative to this. I know that we have a lot more 22.5 or 50 pound and 35 pound dumbbells, and that's what gyms typically have, but we probably don't have that many of the other dumbbells. So I've got to be careful about dumbbell loading and how I put that into a class. Otherwise you're going to be in a position where you don't have enough dumbbells to people standing around and they can't execute it.
I mean, we noticed that with the TFL. Also, when we started this new group program, the clientele or the avatars that we're bringing into the gym was completely different from the compete athlete, where we are using a lot of more 22.5 and 17.5 kg dumbbells. We were now looking, well, shit, actually, we need lighter dumbbells. So we've got obviously the PT room where we had the full stack, and we've now brought them in from the PT room.
We didn't have enough 2.5s,
fives, 7.5s, 8s, 9s, and we've got a full rack now in the main gym floor. But that's because we figured that out to run TFL classes, right?
Yeah, and I think there's many ways around it. For example, I know if I'm, sometimes we put D-balls in the program, and we know we don't have that many D-balls. We've got one of each weight. And we've got sometimes a class of 15 people. So how do you make that work?
It's like EMOMs.
Well, that's where you got things like circuits or EMOMs where you're breaking a group of 12 into 4 groups of 3.
Yeah, that's
well,
manageable.
then you only need 3 D-balls and you can still make it work. So again, once you know your equipment requirements, there are definitely clever ways that you can play with it. Whereas something like a barbell, with the space that we have, we can afford to have every person on a barbell. When I think back 2 years ago, before we got this extension of the space, we would have 15-person classes, 3/4 of the space. That meant that every day we'd program a barbell workout. It would have to be done in partners, and I would always have to consider that in writing it. So I couldn't afford to do like a 10-rep barbell complex as an EMOM because people are probably going to take more than 30 seconds there, and you can't get people in partners. So, just understanding how much equipment you have relative to the space that you have. And then relative to the amount of people you have in a class is super important. You just got to think about that with every single exercise you write. Is this actually going to be able to work, or am I going to create a bottleneck, or am I going to just have people, floundering around trying to make it work? Exactly. One thing I always think about with us is like V-bar dips. We've only got 3 dip stations, so that's something I'll only program really on perform compete
and
day.
It's a big EMOM.
Exactly. You have to make it a big EMOM to get it in. Okay, so I think space available and equipment available, those are important things. Class flow.
Yeah, I think that's super important.
Yeah, so when I think about class flow, I'm thinking about, how fluidly does the class run from start to finish?
Yes.
So there are lots of things that could interrupt the fluidity of a class. It could be equipment.
Yeah.
So for example, if A work is with a barbell, B work is with a rower, C work is with dumbbells and assault bikes, and D work is with skipping. There's a lot of time spent there in a 60-minute class just setting up a room, putting equipment away and getting new pieces of equipment out and having to warm it up. So that's something I always think about. Just like how disjointed does a session go? I also think about exercise selection. So, I know if we warm up clean, if we start the session with, let's say, squat cleans, if I put front squats in for B work, that's a super easy transition because they've already got barbells out. They've warmed up the barbell. They've warmed up the squat position. So that's going to be a 0-second transition moving from a squat clean into a front squat. Now, if we went from front squats to suddenly power snatches, the barbell's still out, but you've got 2 completely different movements with lots of different movement patterns you have to warm up there. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the workout or the day that comes to my mind when we're talking about this is, remember a couple of weeks ago, I think it was on a Friday, where we had A work was, I think it was an overhead complex snatch grip. Then we went into front squats and then went into bench press. So that whole basically Friday workout was spent at the rig.
Yes.
So the flow of that class was really, really good because essentially we started at the rig and we finished at the rig for the full 60 minutes.
We used a barbell for everything.
Barbell for everything. So it was great. So that came to mind because it was such a nice flow over that 60 minutes.
Yeah. And I think even when I'm thinking about flow, I'm thinking about the movement of the room. Like if you're going from a wall to the rig to empty space to the back of the room to the front of the room, that's something else you got to consider as well. And when I'm writing these programs now, I'm also thinking about our affiliates. We have a bunch of affiliates all on these programs as well, and I want to consider those things. And again, you can't please everyone. So first and foremost, it's cater to the majority and then just help those other people that have maybe some nuances to make it work for them.
I think also with the flow, it's like you said, we're thinking about all those things, but we're also thinking about controlling the people from A to B. So when I talk about controlling now, I know we're going to get into it, but like EMOMs, versus, oh, just take your own rest. Do front squats, rest 90 seconds to 120 seconds. And don't get me wrong, sometimes we will program that, but it's a lot easier if you've got, for example, every 2 minutes we're going front squats and you're alternating with pull-ups, for example.
Yes.
Clock hits 2, you move on to the next one. Instead of giving people the opportunity to take their own rest, sometimes it can come a bit messy.
Yeah, and the reason I love things like EMOMs or every 90s or every 2 minutes is that when you're calculating the time taken to complete a workout, when you're sitting there as a programmer, it's a lot easier to know exactly. You know, whereas you write A1, A2, bench press and pull up, rest 60 seconds. Well, people always take 60 seconds. It may take a bit longer. And
sometimes it takes shorter.
Yeah, that can be anywhere between, let's say, 6 to 9 minutes. Yeah. Whereas if you write EMOM or every 90 seconds for 6 sets, so 3 of each, you know exactly it's going to be 9 minutes. Like it's not going to be any longer or any shorter than 9 minutes. I will say there's advantages, disadvantages of it though. I think sometimes when you are running everything on an EMOM or every 90, it can sometimes kill the vibe of a class, because I find the class and the coach become clock watchers. Right. So rather than engaging each other and having a good time, we're just focused on making sure we're hitting the time that you kind of you'll kind of do an exercise and then you'll just stand there like a zombie for 45 seconds looking at the clock, and then you'll kind of move again. And sometimes I don't always like that. I think trying to get a balance of give people time to manage their own rest, because I think there's a skill in that as well.
For sure.
You know, like sometimes
especially in sport.
Yeah, well, sometimes we'll say, okay, you know, you've got 4 sets of back squats, you've got 10 minutes to complete this. Yeah. By putting that in there, it teaches people how to manage their own rest. And as a coach, you know, okay, I've still got a cut off on this. You know, I know that by 10 minutes I'll be done. I'll be moving on to my next piece.
Nice.
Next one we'll talk about is like complexity of movement. So again, this is complexity of movement is going to relate to the training age and the ability levels of your people. But this is also something I think about in terms of like where I put complexity in a class. Generally speaking, and this is just general programming rules anyway, principles, I should say, not rules. But we generally stack the more complex things at the start of a class or a start of a session. We know that as fatigue creeps in, essentially as athletes, we get dumber. So our ability to execute a high skill movement at the end of 45 minutes of work is a lot harder.
Very different
than at the start. Now, the exception, this is something we've got to think about as programmers. If you do want to include complexity at the end of your class, make sure it's a complex movement that has already been touched in the start of a class. So for example, let's say you wanted to do, power clean. So like, for example, today we all did a session where the session finished with a complex of 5 deadlifts into 5 hang power cleans into an assault bike. But we had already warmed up cleans in our A work and the primer, and our B work where we did a clean and jerk complex. So I knew that people would have already done the movement. So it would be easy to then step away from cleans where we went into muscle ups and chest to bars and come back to them and know that people had already dialed the movement in and we were going to be fine. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked, especially in the CrossFit and the functional fitness space, especially when you are dealing with, let's say, people with younger training ages, that you got to understand that like front loading complexity versus back loaded complexity is very different. Now, what we mean by front loading, it's like, okay, say we are working for every 2 minutes, for example, what we've done today. So we done the deadlifts into hang power clean. So that complexity was front loaded, because after we done our complex, we went into assault bike. Yep. Now, if that had been flip reverse,
which it was last week, but that was only programmed for perform and compete. Yep. We probably wouldn't program something like that for live. Yeah.
Why? Because you've now got to look what's happening. People are getting fatigued aerobically, heart rate's through the roof, and then you're asking them to go into a complex challenging movement. 9 times out of 10, that's where injury happens, right?
And so when we do program that for live program, which they do have on their current cycle, we're using, but we're also using things like kettlebell swings and burpees, or dumbbell hang power cleans versus like a hang clean and jerk with a barbell. So yeah. That's something else I think about with the complexity of movement is the pairing of complexity. So, we saw in one of our classes today where we hadn't got it quite right. And we were looking at a TFL class, and we had programmed hack squats with a foam roller against the wall, which is a great exercise for the quads, combined with Romanian deadlifts with a dumbbell and single arm landmine presses. Now, all those 3 movements are great movements. But when you think about the training age of the people doing it, they're quite young. They're people who are quite new to strength training. And if you'd had any one of those things in isolation, probably would have been perfect, because it would allow the individual to really focus on executing and nailing that movement, and then have a rest and do it again. But when you've got 3 movements to have to do back to back to back, even though there's some rest built in, that's just a lot to remember for a
the
beginner.
brain.
Yeah, exactly. So the nervous system gets overloaded, and we end up wasting time and energy just learning how to do the movement versus actually doing what we wanted to get out of the movement, which is get strong or build some muscle or work close to failure. So I think, just thinking about the movements that you're pairing with. I think another thing with the complexity that you just made me think about with the front loaded, back loaded, is you've also got to think about things like range of motion and movement. So for example, I remember doing a drop in, I think I was in Spain, and the workout was bench press as their A work, and then it went into some fatigue based squat snatching. Now, I understand the intention was the bench press was going to be heavy bench pressing, and then the squat snatching was going to be lighter. So from a neurological standpoint, I understood they put the heavy work first. But when you think about what muscles are involved in a bench press versus what muscles are involved in a squat snatch, is that the bench press hadn't set us up for squat snatching at all. And the way that the class flowed was that there was no time to warm up the squat snatches. So basically you went from not using your overhead position, not using your squat, not using much coordination, to being like, okay, now you're gonna have to do that
Full range of motion.
Exactly, like the fullest range of motion movement you could possibly do with a barbell. And I just thought straight away, like, this is where a programmer needs to think about these kind of things. If you'd have switched it, started with the squat snatch piece first, even though it's more conditioning based, and then moved into a strength piece after, that could have still worked. Or you did squat snatching isolated and put the bench press into conditioning piece, that would have worked. But in the way that was set, the flow didn't quite work. And like, as people doing the class, it just didn't feel correct. I think this is massive tangent here, but I think often programmers don't think about them doing the class themselves. Because I often see people write programs, and I think that just doesn't, that the flow of that, or just the points that we just touched on already, doesn't make sense. And then I think about the person programming it, and I'm like, you wouldn't do that. So I think the easiest thing to think about is, like, I always put myself, and I think this is the advantage that we both have, is that we do the programs that we write. So you kind of get first-hand experience in what you've written to see if it was actually good and how you can improve it. But I'm always thinking, when I'm writing it, thinking about me flowing through the class and being like, would this make sense and would this feel good if I was doing it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when it gets to programming, if they're not doing the programming, they're just writing it, it's like, let me put as much complexity and as much sexiness as I can put within this 60 minutes, because that's what's going to, essentially, that's what I'm selling, that's what's going to sell. But it's like, put yourself through your programming. We go back to those basic principles of just being a coach in general. If you're prescribing something, essentially you should be doing it in some way, shape or form, right?
Yeah. And if you're not doing it, like, at least watching it and observing it every single day and learning from it. Awesome. Combinations of movements. I think I was kind of just touching on this just now. Yeah. But I think, I'll try and think about having carryover in the majority of the movements of that training session. So what I mean by that is that, I know that if there's a squatting movement, heavier squatting movement is being involved in A work, that opens up the ability for me to program maybe some like lighter, less complex squatting movement, later air squats, wall balls, light thrusters, light overhead squats, because I know that their body has been primed for that movement, and I can create some small adjustments and it's still going to run smoothly. Whereas I think that bench press squat snatch example I just gave is a great example of like the combinations of movements wasn't really thought about. Of course, other things as well. You've also got to think about managing fatigue in the individual. So, you can't doing strict pull-ups and then going into muscle-ups and then doing some chest to bar conditioning whilst the movements are similar and it would prime them for it. That's just probably too much pulling work on a pretty small set of muscles. That's going to mean that they're not going to be able to get the dose response that you intended for them to get by the time they get there.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes back to, I'm going to say it again, but just writing something and going testing it out. Like you said, if that testing it out is you actually just putting yourself in the room and thinking about how that would actually flow, and how flow is one, but how's it actually going to feel? Like, we talk a lot about dose responses. Like, it's harder to manage a dose response with a class of 16 people. Don't get me wrong, it's challenging compared to if you're just writing for one person. But that's why we have prerequisites. And I know that there's there's lots of pros with prerequisites, but there's also lots of cons with prerequisites. But the way that we've chosen with the LPC class group class program is that there is prerequisites. There's a fundamental process. That just makes it a lot easier for the programmer to then understand, right, within these 16 people, what's my general avatar? I've got parameters that I want to work with, and that allows you to control the dose response a lot more easier, right?
And if we put that into simple terms, what we mean by the dose response is that when we program something, we have an intended adaptation that should take place.
Feeling and adaptation.
A feeling and adaptation that should take place in wake of doing that exercise. So for example, if I'm programming dumbbell bench press, 3 sets of 10, my intention is that, the last couple of reps are getting challenging and that we are training hypertrophy or trying to build muscle mass on this individual. So when we say managing the dose response, let's say, for example, where I think a lot of CrossFit programs get it wrong is they program, let's say, 5 sets of 1 back squat. So doing really, really heavy back squats. Now, for a client who has a high training age, and they've been back squatting for years and years and years, they're going to be able to express a really
great
heavy
protocol
single.
for sure.
And it's a fantastic, absolute strength protocol. But for the person, my mum, who stepped into the gym and it's her first day and she's doing 5 sets of 1, she hasn't developed the motor control or the technique, and she hasn't developed enough strength to be able to elicit anything heavy. So for her, what she's getting out the 5 sets of 1 is completely different to what the experienced athlete is getting. And what Liam, you're saying is that by having prerequisites, minimum requirements in terms of skills, but in terms of training age, but in terms of strength numbers as well, you're basically ensuring that when you program something, 99% of the people are going to get the intended intention that you have set out.
Yes.
Awesome. I like this one, finishing the class on a high. Now, this is not a golden rule by any means, but it's something we always think about when we're writing programs, is that when we're thinking about group class, we want people to leave having had a bloody good time.
Yes.
And so exercise selection and what you program will dictate this. So typically we like to finish sessions I like to think about people being together somehow, or it's working in unison or sharing something. That always tends to leave this feeling of bonding and shared, I don't know, togetherness. I can't even think of what the word is, you know what I mean?
100%.
Something else to think about is maybe finishing with your heart rate a little bit more elevated than you started. Do the important but the more boring stuff at the start, because no one remembers that when they finish a class, to be honest, and finish on a high. Those are things I always want to think about. So maybe finishing a class with 3 sets of 60 seconds side planks. Whilst it's a great exercise and maybe really important and something that people need to do, it's not the most riveting way to finish. And if it's a Friday as well, it's a Friday class, the end of the week, and they're finishing, just holding 60-second side planks by themselves, versus, maybe doing some farmers carries and some assault bikes and some sit-ups, and it continues. Both are kind of core style training, but there's a very different dose response there, or a very different feeling that it leaves you. What are you thinking?
No, I totally agree. I think it's we've got to remember that most people that are coming to our gym, right, for 60 minutes, it's 60 minutes out of their day that they really look forward to. So it's okay, we've got to make sure that they're having a really good time within that 60 minutes, right? We spend all day in the gym and it's great, we love it. But can you imagine if I've done it where I've not been working in a gym. My time to go to the gym is the best time of the day. It's I'm going to see my friends, having a good laugh, music's on, doing some cool stuff. Now, me finishing on a high, we talked about the other day with TFL. It's we were kind of sometimes strength training can be quote unquote not fun, not sexy. It's kind of boring, right? We get that. But always depends on the coach, right? Side tangent. But bring it back to the point is that if you're finishing with, 3 sets of 10 of goblet squats and right, bye guys, it's a bit boring. But you do, like you said, you've got your priorities in, you've done your squatting, you've done your pulling, you've done your hinging, and you finish with something fun, I don't know, banded pull aparts into carries into something, and you're finishing a high five. That is a great way to finish the class.
It's I was just going to say banded pull aparts, because we've had our Fridays the last couple of cycles and Liverpool competed
banded Y raises
have been a bit more bodybuilding strength by a session where we're not doing any conditioning work. But I make sure that the session finishes with something where I'm envisioning I want people to be grinding through some reps.
My delts.
Yeah, exactly. Even if they're just training their rhomboids, or their rear delts. But it's finishing, being I feel like I've done some work today. and I'm sweating and I'm kind of like, I'm finishing with that like uncomfortable pump. That versus finishing like a side plank, a 30-second side plank, very different.
Very different. Yeah.
Something to think about. Setting up and packing away. I think this comes back to equipment. We talked about this already, but just always factoring in the time taken and the administration. I should also say that it takes to set up a room is super important. So like, for example, we know we often do on Tuesdays, we do aerobic work, which often requires all the ergs to be out. Yeah. And so that's something you got to think about as well. Is like, how long does it take to set up ergs? And if you're removing the rowers halfway through the session and you're trying to create space for something else, well, there's like 5 minutes gone. Doing nothing, doing any, you're not doing any fitness, you're not coaching anyone. You're just trying to clear up a training room so that you can actually do your next piece. So trying to kind of like, if you require big pieces of equipment, keep them out for the whole session and integrate them into the whole session somehow, so that time is not lost just putting away and packing away stuff.
I mean, also just on packing away, like when I run a group class, I'll always look at like the timeline and I'll reverse engineer. It's like, I want to be finished, whatever that last piece is, I want to finish by 55. One, that gives me time to pack away stuff, but then it's like, okay guys, once you've packed everything away, make sure you're high-fiving each other. And it also gives them time to bond and stuff. Oh, that was a great workout, yeah, how did you feel, etc. So just a simple side note, try and finish your class by 55. That gives you that buffer going into your next class.
I don't know why I always think about this, but I always think about benches. Like, benches are a bit of a pain in the ass.
Some of our benches as well.
Some of some need some serious dose of
WD-40. Let's go.
But I mean, like, benches is one of those things. Like, if you're having to set up 8 benches in a room for one exercise for 5 minutes of a class, it's just kind of not really worth your time and effort. So if I'm bringing benches out, like, I want to probably be using them at least twice. So for example, if I've got a hip thrust, I'm going to use that bench for a dumbbell bench press. So you're just doubling up, so you don't have to wheel that thing out a couple of times. Something you already alluded to is like rest management. So this is where like EMOMs every 90s versus letting people manage their own time. Rest. Again, like, just can be a really useful tool to help you really manage time in a class to make sure people are starting at the right times. But I think that don't get too accustomed to using them all the time. Sometimes, we as coaches, maybe there's like an A1 or an A2 or B1 and B2 where you're moving between, let's say, a walking lunge and a pull-up. And we just decide on the moment, we're going to make this an every 90, because that's basically going to satisfy the 60-second rest that has been prescribed, but it allows us to have a little bit more control of the class and allows a class to know exactly when to go. So sometimes those are kind of just things that as a coach, you can just add those things in, even if it's not written down, just to give you a bit more control.
Yeah, I think with the every 90 and the every 75, why I really like it as well, it also controls a bit more of the dose response. Because what I find, sometimes if you give newer, especially younger training age individuals, say you give them 10 minutes to do 3 sets. Like
they do it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, they do it in like 3 minutes. You're like, mate, you got another 7 minutes on the clock. So why I like those, especially with younger athletes, it just controls it a lot better in terms of when they should actually be lifting.
Yes, I agree. Okay, let's talk about managing dose response. We talked about what dose response means. There's a couple of things that we do. I think we do this pretty well, and I think people need to think about it. Obviously, we talked already about having prerequisites, and that already narrows down or improves the accuracy of anything that you program, because you know that everyone in your class is of a certain standard and they meet the requirements. But things like giving rep schemes and basically teaching people how to pick an appropriate rep for them. So we do this with aerobic work a lot, rather than just saying 20 calorie assault bike, 20 burpees, 20 wall balls, we actually say something like between 10 to 20 calorie assault bike, 10 to 20 wall balls, 10 to 20 burpees. Pick a rep range that's appropriate to you. Now, an important piece to this is that you then need to explain what appropriate is. So that might be like all movements must be completed unbroken. Each round should take you no longer than 3 minutes to complete, using time as like a determinant. So I love that, because essentially it's further individualizing the training to be more appropriate to that individual. Now, again, that's such an important part to this. If you're writing programs for people online, then your notes have to be thorough. They have to be detailed. They have to basically say everything that you would say if you were standing in front of them. If this is just a class run program with a coach, well, then your coaches need to be educated on how to educate a member on how to pick the appropriate rep scheme to them. But I do love it. Like, I will often probably think about doing the upper rep scheme on everything, especially with conditioning work, because I kind of think of myself as being fit, but I'll often pick like a mid-range because I'm just like on the day I'm like I don't feel like pushing that hard. I'd rather take it easy. I'm gonna focus on quality a little bit more here. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's the power of education and the power of communicating what you want outside of, or what you want of the actual training session. And that's the importance of, like, when you're doing your brief, it's like, guys, how are you feeling? It's like, you don't have to go into a full conversation with 16 people in front of you, but I know we'll ask a general, or thumbs up, thumbs in the middle, thumbs down. You're then going up to these individuals that have said thumbs down, or how's your day? Oh, I didn't sleep too good last night. Right, great. We've got aerobic work coming up. We've got a rep range. See how you feel. Maybe go on the lower end of the rep range today and see how you get on.
Yeah, love it. Time versus task dependent.
Yeah, so
this is a super important one.
Especially with conditioning work, we see it a lot, right?
Yeah, so what we mean by that, a time-dependent workout would be something like an AMRAP, 10 minutes. Have I got that right? No.
Task dependent with like a 4 rounds for
4
time.
rounds of time.
Yeah.
Time dependent.
With like an AMRAP.
AMRAP, yeah. I did, yeah. I don't know, you just gave me a look where you were like, what? You made me second guess myself. So both, if you're talking about the sport of CrossFit, both are super important because the sport is going to test you in rounds for time, and they're also going to test you in AMRAPs. But when you're running this in a class, what you need to consider is that an AMRAP is going to control the room because everyone's going to start and everyone's going to finish at the same time.
Yeah.
Task-dependent work, so rounds for time, is going to mean that your room is going to be finishing at different times, which is going to be potentially chaotic.
Yes.
So you got to find a balance between both of these. AMRAPs are always an easier way to do it, but it's not always what you want to do. Like sometimes you just want to program a round at a time. So think sometimes what I'll do with task dependent work is that we'll program rounds at a time. But again, in the coach's notes, we'll put a cap on it, number one, or we give those rep schemes and clear intentions to help people pick the appropriate rep scheme so that everyone is finishing roughly around the same time. Something else we'll do often is we'll do like interval based work where it'll be like you're going to go row, burpee, wall ball, rest 2 minutes, and you're going to complete 5 sets of it. Sometimes what we'll do is I'll put a 45-minute overall cap. Be like, in 45 minutes, complete anywhere between 4 to 6 sets of this. And so that allows people to do task-dependent work, but also
you're just controlling it a bit more.
You're still controlling the room. Everyone's starting at the same time. Everyone will finish. Some people may get 4 sets. Some people get 5. Some people get 6. When we do task-dependent work is our Saturday testers.
Yes.
You know, Saturday testers for us is where we basically program a competition style workout. But we also know in a Saturday tester, that's pretty much the only thing we're doing. You're coming in, you're hitting a workout really hard, and then you're finishing. There isn't like an A, B, C, D piece to it, which means generally you've got more time to play with. And you can create bigger time caps. And so on the Saturdays is probably where we'll do more task-dependent work, knowing that it's okay if someone finishes 10 minutes before someone else. Like we've allotted that time in a class to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that we got some feedback on so after the Open this year, after the CrossFit season, we sat down and we were like, okay, what do we want this next year to look like in terms of group class programming? And one of the things that we came up with is like, we done a lot of time-dependent aerobic work. So typically for us, it's aerobic Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays, we're doing our conditioning work. We were doing a lot of the time-dependent. So okay, let's try and play around with a bit more task-dependent. And I think this year, we're coming up towards the Open now, we have kind of found that sweet spot between the task and the time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, if we look at even our Aerobic Tuesdays right now, we've got an A and B template. On the A template, it's task-dependent long work. On the B template, it's time-dependent, shorter interval-based work. Awesome. Liam, that was fun.
That was great.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all your thoughts on that. Great input. For folks who are listening, if you are writing group programs or group class programs, hopefully this conversation provided some food for thought and got some practical takeaways for you to start crushing your group programs.
Let's go.
Until next time, guys.
Cheers. Bye-bye.